I had just leaned back into the leather armchair in the living room of my small villa in Fairview Heights, Virginia, less than an hour's drive from the FBI headquarters in Quantico. A steaming glass of red wine, my favorite Cabernet Sauvignon, rested comfortably in my right hand, while my left held the TV remote, my thumb lazily sliding over the buttons without bothering to pick a channel. After months submerged in the biggest financial fraud case my FBI team had ever tackled, I finally had an evening to breathe. But before I could savor the peaceful moment, a rapid series of knocks pounded on the door, like drumbeats signaling an approaching storm. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest video. But that peace didn't last long. The knocks weren't the gentle taps of a neighbor dropping by, but more like someone trying to punch the door rather than knock. I frowned, setting the remote down on the glass table with a small clack. The glass of wine stayed put on the table, its steam rising into the warm air of the room. I wasn't expecting guests, not at this hour, not here. Eleanor stepped out from the kitchen, a dish towel in hand, her eyebrows raised in curiosity. "Who's banging on the door like they're breaking it down?" she asked, her tone a mix of surprise and irritation. I shrugged, rising from the armchair, my gray loafers making soft steps on the wooden floor. "Probably some delivery guys who got the wrong address," I said, though I didn't quite believe my own answer. Fairview Heights wasn't the kind of place where deliveries went astray, especially with the HOA scrutinizing every detail. I walked toward the front door, my shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal a firm forearm. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, I caught a glimpse of a few figures standing on the porch, at least 3, their postures stiff, not at all like clumsy delivery workers. A twinge of unease flickered through me, not fear, I'd faced too many dangerous types to be rattled by a few knocks, but a mix of annoyance and curiosity. I opened the door and I had to stifle a laugh at the sight before me. 3 men stood on the porch, chests puffed out as if they were about to raid a criminal hideout, rather than knock on a villa door in Fairview Heights. The leader, a middle-aged guy with a bushy mustache and cheap sunglasses covering half his face, stepped forward, flashing a shiny badge that looked more like a toy than anything official. The other 2 stood behind him, a scrawny one clutching a camera, and a chubby one cradling a crumpled stack of papers like it was vital evidence. They wore suits, cheap, wrinkled, clearly ill-fitting, and exuded an over-the-top confidence that, with my decades of experience, I instantly recognized as fake. "Mr. Daniel Hargrove," the mustache guy said, his voice deep, and trying to sound authoritative, though the way he emphasized each word felt more theatrical than genuine. I crossed my arms, raised an eyebrow, and didn't answer right away, just observed. He pressed on, ignoring my silence. "We're from the Fairview HOA Compliance Investigation Unit. I'm Victor Malone, and these are my associates, Eddie Klein and Tommy Russo." He gestured to the 2 behind him, both nodding solemnly like bit players in a B movie. "We need your immediate cooperation to investigate some serious violations in this area." I tilted my head, my sharp gaze sweeping over the trio. I'd faced all kinds of criminals, from cunning drug dealers to white-collar con artists. But this bunch was something entirely new. "Investigation?" I asked, my tone even but laced with a hint of sarcasm that Victor clearly missed. "Yes, sir," Victor replied, pushing his sunglasses up his nose even though it was already dark out. "We've received reports that you've violated multiple HOA regulations, specifically, the blue curtains in your living room, unapproved, then the shrubbery in your front yard too tall for standards, and your car in the garage parked improperly." Eleanor, still standing behind me near the kitchen entrance, overheard the ridiculous accusations, and let out a soft laugh. I glanced over my shoulder, catching her eyes, amused and incredulous, before turning back to Victor. "My curtains," I repeated, my tone suggesting I was trying to confirm I'd heard right. I looked out the window, where the deep blue curtains hung neatly, the ones Eleanor picked because they matched the sofa. "And the shrubbery? You mean the rose bush I trimmed last week?" Victor nodded, his expression grave as if he'd just uncovered a national conspiracy. "That's right. Per the latest HOA rules, all aesthetic changes must be pre-approved. And your car." He turned to Eddie, the scrawny one with the camera, and gestured. Eddie fumbled to raise it, like he was about to snap a crime scene photo, but his shaky hands nearly dropped it. "It's over the line in the garage," Eddie piped up, his voice cracking with nerves. Tommy, the chubby one, added, "We've got pictures from last week as proof." I crossed my arms tighter, fighting the urge to burst out laughing. I'd interrogated professional liars, criminals who could spin tales without blinking. But this crew was so clumsy, it was almost funny. "So you've been snapping pictures of my car in the garage?" I asked, my voice calm but icy. Victor straightened, trying to regain control. "It's our job. The Compliance Investigation Unit has the right to monitor all properties in Fairview Heights. You need to cooperate, or pay a $500 fine right here to avoid a report to the processing center. Processing center, I echoed, a spark of amusement in my eyes. I glanced at Eleanor, who'd stepped closer to the door, still holding the dish towel, her lips pressed tight to keep from laughing aloud. Sounds more like a prison than an HOA office, she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I turned back to Victor, still composed but already analyzing in my head. This wasn't my first run-in with imposters, but posing as HOA detectives was a new twist. So who gave you this authority? I asked, my voice soft but sharp, the way I'd once pried info from suspects. Victor opened his mouth to reply, but I already knew the answer wouldn't hold water. I stood still at the threshold, arms crossed tighter, my keen eyes scanning the three self-proclaimed detectives from the Fairview HOA Compliance Investigation Unit. Victor Malone, the mustached leader, still tried to project authority, though his cheap sunglasses slid down his nose. Eddie Klein, the scrawny one with a trembling camera in hand, and Tommy Russo, the chubby one clutching a rumpled stack of papers, flanked him, nodding like poorly trained pups. I raised an eyebrow, my lips curling into a faint, mocking smile that Victor clearly didn't catch. With a decade of FBI experience, I dealt with enough liars to know this trio wasn't just amateur. They were digging their own grave. Since when does the HOA have detectives? I asked, my tone flat but tinged with feigned curiosity, as if I genuinely wanted to hear the answer. Victor straightened, pushing his sunglasses up, trying to reclaim the upper hand after my unexpected question. We're a special unit, he replied, his deep voice straining for seriousness. Fairview HOA established the Compliance Investigation Unit to ensure all residents follow the rules, and we don't tolerate non-cooperation. Eddie nodded frantically, nearly dropping the camera, while Tommy muttered something about community responsibility. I tilted my head, pretending to mull it over. Interesting, I said, my voice soft but cold. So who gave you this authority? The FBI? Department of the Interior? Or did the coffee table crew at the HOA office just appoint themselves detectives? I paused, watching their reactions. Victor opened his mouth, but Eddie jumped in. We've got authority from the council. These are official documents. He raised the camera like it was irrefutable proof, though his shaking hands made me bite back a laugh. All right, I nodded, my tone like I was humoring a child. Show me the documents. If you've got authority, you must have a license to operate, right? Or at least a piece of paper from this so-called council of yours. I held out my hand, waiting. Victor hesitated for a second, then signaled Tommy. The chubby one fumbled through his stack, pulling out a creased smudged sheet and holding it up with odd pride. Here, Tommy said, his voice wavering. Your official violation notice. I took the paper, glancing over it. It looked like something hastily printed from a home printer, the text crooked, with a bolded header. Fairview HOA Compliance Notice. It listed my offenses: unapproved blue curtains, shrubbery exceeding the 0.5 meter height limit, and a car in the garage over the line by 10 centimeters. I smirked, locking eyes with Victor. My curtains, I repeated, as if puzzling out a riddle. You're serious? And the shrubbery? You mean the rose bush my wife planted last year? Victor nodded, his face rigid. That's right. Per the latest rules, all aesthetic changes must be pre-approved. You didn't submit a request. Eddie chimed in, voice shaky. Section 4, Clause B, Line 12. It clearly states shrubbery can't exceed the height limit. He glanced at the camera, as if it'd recite the rule for him. Tommy added, and your car, we've got pictures. It's not within the lines. I turned to Eleanor, now standing right behind me, dish towel in hand, her eyes twinkling with amusement. You hear that? I asked her, my tone playful. They've got photos of my car in the garage. Probably snapped them from some bush. Eleanor pressed her lips together, stifling a laugh. Maybe they measured the curtains with a ruler too, she whispered, loud enough for me to hear. I turned back, staring straight at Victor. So you've been creeping around my house to measure plants and photograph my car. Nice gig. Victor flushed, but still tried to maintain his crumbling air of authority. We're not snooping. It's community oversight. And if you don't cooperate, we'll have to report you to the processing center. I raised an eyebrow again. Processing center? I asked, my tone amused. You mean the HOA has a prison? Or is it that meeting room with a do not enter sign tacked on to scare people? Eleanor couldn't hold it in anymore, bursting into laughter, startling Tommy and causing a few papers to slip from his grasp onto the porch floor. Victor, furious, took a step forward. This isn't a joke. Violating HOA rules is a serious matter. You need to pay a $500 fine right now, or we'll take stronger measures. He gestured to Eddie, who fumbled to pull out a small notebook and started scribbling something, while Tommy hastily picked up the fallen papers. I watched them, my mind shifting into investigation mode. I knew this crew wasn't legit. No license, no authority, just some guys in cheap suits playing detective. But I wanted to see how much more they'd reveal before I shut this farce down. So what's next? I asked, my voice soft but sharp as a blade. What happens if I don't pay? You'll call the cops? Or handles me yourselves? I stood still, waiting, my eyes glinting with the light. Any FBI agent under me would recognize the light of someone setting a trap. Victor Malone stood on my porch, his face red with humiliation, but still clinging to his fading authority. He raised a hand, pointing straight at me, his cheap sunglasses slipping down his nose to reveal furious eyes. Eddie Klein, the scrawny one, stopped scribbling in his little notebook, his trembling hands clutching the camera like it was his last shield. Tommy Russo, the chubby one, finished picking up his dropped papers and stood up, panting, clutching the crumpled stack tightly. I kept my arms crossed, my gaze sharp, but my lips twitching into a faint smirk, as if I were watching a clumsy play nearing its end. Eleanor, behind me near the kitchen entrance, covered her mouth to hide a grin, but her eyes sparkled with delight. You think this is a joke? Victor growled, his deep voice cracking with anger. I've said it already. Violating HOA rules is serious. If you don't pay the $500 fine right now, we'll report you to the processing center and seize your property. He raised a tiny recorder, hitting the red button as if capturing evidence. Everything you say is being recorded, and we have the authority to act if you don't comply. Eddie nodded frantically, lifting the camera to snap a photo, but his shaky hands only produced a useless click. I tilted my head, the mocking smile on my lips widening slightly. Processing center, I repeated, my tone savoring the absurdity like a puzzle. What's that? An HOA jail? Or are you planning to build an iron cage in the office to lock up people who won't change their curtains? Eleanor lost it, laughing out loud, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Victor turned to her, his face reddening further, but I raised a hand to stop him, my eyes still locked on the mustached man. Careful, I said, my voice calm but icy. My wife's laughing because you're ridiculous, not because of me. Victor took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. You don't get it, he snarled, stepping closer to the threshold. We have the right to take you to the processing center if you resist. It's not a prison, it's a compliance enforcement facility. He signaled Eddie, who clumsily pulled a pair of plastic handcuffs from his vest pocket, the cheap flimsy kind that'd snap with a hard tug. Cooperate, Mr. Hargrove, Eddie said, his voice quivering as he held up the cuffs like they were a supreme weapon. Or we'll have to use stronger measures. I looked at the cuffs, then at Eddie, then back to Victor. I chuckled, not a loud laugh, but a dry, quiet one, that any FBI agent under me would recognize as a sign of waning patience. What are you going to do with those? I asked, my tone playful but my eyes flashing with danger. Cuff me over blue curtains, or a rose bush taller than 0.5 meters, or the car in my garage you've been stalking for a week. I took a step forward, still arms crossed, but my stance now firmer, like someone ready to act. Victor stepped back half a pace, clearly rattled by my presence, but still barked. Don't push us. You'll go to the processing center, and I guarantee you'll regret it. Tommy jumped in, his voice shaky. We have the right, you can't resist. I turned to the chubby one, raising an eyebrow. Right? Then show me your license. Or at least something proving you're not just clowns in cheap suits playing detective. Victor lost his patience, shoving the recorder near my face. Enough. Cooperate, or we'll handle it ourselves. He signaled Eddie, and the scrawny one stepped forward, raising the plastic cuffs, clearly intending to follow through. I didn't budge, my gaze shifting from amusement to ice cold. I'd played along long enough to see this crew wasn't just foolish, but reckless, a dangerous mix if not stopped. I'm busy, I said, my voice even but firm, so I'll decline your invite to this processing center. Victor roared. You don't have a choice. He lunged forward, hand outstretched as if to grab me, but I wasn't smiling anymore. I'd seen enough. My hand quietly moved to the smartwatch on my left wrist, not to check the time, but to press a hidden button on the side. An emergency signal, sent straight to my FBI team, via a secure line. I didn't need to say anything, didn't need to explain, just wait. And while waiting, I stared straight at Victor, my eyes sharp as knives. You just made a big mistake, I said, my voice so low it froze. Eddie in his tracks, the plastic cuffs clattering to the porch floor. I stood motionless at the threshold, my steel-cold gaze fixed on Victor Malone. The mustached man had just reached to grab me, but now froze, clearly unnerved by my stare. Eddie Klein stood petrified, the plastic cuffs hitting the porch with a clack, his trembling hands unable to retrieve them. Tommy Russo, the chubby one, clutched his crumpled papers, mouth agape as if realizing he'd stumbled onto the wrong stage. Eleanor, behind me, stopped laughing, but her eyes still glinted with a mix of amusement and curiosity. I was done playing. I pressed a button on my smartwatch, the emergency signal sent straight to my FBI team via a secure line, and now I just had to wait. But before they arrived, I wanted this crew to expose themselves a bit more. You just made a big mistake, I repeated, my voice low and steady, the way I'd spoken to suspects in interrogation rooms. Victor tried to steady himself, pushing his sunglasses up his nose, but his hand shook slightly. You can't scare us, he growled, his voice breaking with stress. We have the right. You'll go to the processing center, and I'll make sure you pay. He shoved the recorder near my face again, as if it could salvage the situation. I tilted my head, my eyes flashing with danger. Right? I asked, my tone mocking but cutting like a blade. What right? The right to impersonate investigators and threaten people. Victor flushed, but still tried to deflect. We're not impersonating. We're the Fairview HOA Compliance Investigation Unit. The council gave us authority. Eddie jumped in, voice trembling. That's right. We have papers. He bent to pick up the cuffs, but his clumsy hands sent them skittering further. Tommy added, you broke the rules, and we've got photos to prove it. I let out a dry, cold chuckle, the kind any agent under me knew meant I'd run out of patience. Photos? I asked. Of my car in the garage? My wife's shrubbery? You think that's enough to intimidate me? I took a step forward, still arms crossed, but my stance now radiating the authority of someone who'd led hundreds of agents in major cases. Victor stumbled back, nearly tripping over Eddie, but still shouted, you won't get away. We'll make you comply. He signaled Eddie, and the scrawny one recklessly stepped forward, raising the newly retrieved plastic cuffs, clearly about to try it. I didn't flinch, just locked eyes with Eddie. You're going to cuff me with that? I asked, my voice soft but so cold. Eddie froze, his face paling. Enough, I said, my tone firm. I turned to Victor, my gaze piercing. You're not detectives. You have no authority. I've played along long enough to see you're a bunch of fakes. And worse, clumsy fakes. I paused, letting the words sink in. Impersonating investigators is a criminal offense. Depending on what you try next, it could be unlawful detention. How far do you want to take this? Victor's mouth fell open, but no words came out. Eddie stepped back, the cuffs dropping again, while Tommy stammered, We were just following orders. I didn't let them finish their excuses. My hand moved lightning fast, not to strike, but to pivot, step inside, and lock the front door with the electronic keypad beside it. The clack sounded, trapping the trio outside on the porch. Victor pounded on the door, yelling, Open it now. You can't do this. But I didn't respond. I turned to Eleanor, now standing close by, and whispered, My team will be here in minutes. Let's see how far these guys get. She smiled, shaking her head. You really can't take a break, can you? Less than 5 minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. I stood by the large window, peering through the blue curtains, the very ones the fake detectives had accused, and saw red and blue lights flashing off the white picket fence. 2 black FBI SUVs screeched into the driveway, tires squealing as they stopped. Victor, Eddie and Tommy turned, their faces drained of color, their earlier bravado vanishing like it never existed. Special Agent Mike Torres, my right-hand man, stepped out of the lead vehicle, hand on his belt, eyes scanning the 3 on the porch. He raised an eyebrow, looking at me through the glass. Boss, I thought you were on leave, Mike asked, his tone half joking, half surprised. I brushed my hands lightly, as if finishing a minor chore, my sharp gaze fixed on Victor Malone. The mustached man now shrank back, clutching the recorder like it was his last lifeline. Eddie Klein, the scrawny one, stood frozen, the plastic cuffs lying abandoned on the porch floor, while Tommy Russo, the chubby one, hugged his crumpled papers, his face pale as if he'd seen a ghost. The 2 black FBI SUVs parked right at the entrance, their red and blue lights bouncing off the white fence of the small garden. Special Agent Mike Torres stepped forward, hand on his belt, his eyes sweeping over the trio before settling on me, a half-joking, half-surprised smile spreading across his lips. Boss, what's with you tangling with these Halloween costume rejects? Mike asked, his deep voice tinged with amusement. He glanced at Victor, Eddie, and Tommy, then back at me, raising an eyebrow. I smirked, stepping aside so Mike and the FBI team could move in. They claimed to be HOA detectives. I replied, my tone dry. Wanted to investigate me over blue curtains and a rosebush in the yard. Thought you guys should handle it before they did something dumber. I pointed at Victor, who was now backing up, nearly tripping over Eddie. Mike laughed, shaking his head. HOA detectives? Guess I need to add that to the Quantico training list. He turned to the trio, his voice shifting to serious. All right, you three. Hands behind your backs. We need to talk. Victor tried to steady himself, pushing his sunglasses up his nose, but his trembling hands sent them clattering to the floor. This is a misunderstanding, he shouted, his voice breaking. We were hired by the Fairview HOA Council. We have the right to investigate. Eddie nodded furiously, but Tommy just mumbled. I was just following orders. I crossed my arms, watching. I'd seen plenty of criminals panic when caught, but this bunch was so clumsy it was almost funny. Mike stepped forward, pulling a real pair of handcuffs, not the cheap plastic kind like Eddie's, from his belt and signaling two other agents from the team. Misunderstanding? Mike asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Let's see this authority of yours. He reached out, snatching the recorder from Victor's hand, then eyed the shiny detective badge pinned to the mustached man's chest. Mike picked it up, turning it over, then glanced at me. Boss, this says HOA Compliance Investigator in Comic Sans. I swear I've never seen a faker badge than this. I chuckled softly, shaking my head. I was hoping they were kidding, but apparently not. I stepped forward, pointing at the white van parked nearby. An old beat-up thing with a crooked HOA Fairview logo slapped on the side. Check their van. Mike, I bet there's more interesting stuff than that recorder. Mike nodded, signaling the team. Two agents moved to the van, popping the back doors and starting to search, while Mike turned back to Victor. IDs, you three. Hand them over. Victor fumbled, pulling his wallet from his vest pocket, his hands shaking so much that a few coins clattered to the floor. Eddie and Tommy reluctantly followed suit, handing over their own crumpled wallets. Mike flipped through each one, turning them over, then raised an eyebrow. No professional licenses, no security credentials, nothing but some expired gym memberships, he said, his tone half joking, half amazed. Where'd you guys get the guts to play detective? Victor tried to argue. We're not impersonating. The council said we had the right to monitor the community. Mike smirked, turning to me. Boss, what do you think? The HOA Council's a law enforcement agency now. I shrugged, my voice even. If so, I'd have to rewrite the entire federal code. I glanced at the van, where an agent was holding up a stack of papers and a small cash box. Mike, check out what they found. Mike stepped over, taking the papers from the agent and flipping through a few pages. Fake invoices, penalty notices, and wow, a cash box. Probably a few $100 in here, he said, his voice tinged with amusement. You guys running a fine collection racket? Victor paled, stammering. That's community fees. We were just collecting under orders. I stepped forward, my gaze cold. Community fees with no receipts, no contracts? You're scamming, not collecting. I turned to Mike. Cuff them. We need to talk to this council that hired them. Mike nodded, signaling the team. The clack of handcuffs echoed as Victor, Eddie, and Tommy were restrained, their faces a picture of misery. From inside the house, Eleanor emerged, holding my glass of wine and handing it to me. Are they done? She asked, her tone playful. I took a sip, smirking. Not yet, it's just getting started. I stood beside the black FBI SUV, sipping the wine Eleanor had handed me, my sharp eyes tracking Victor Malone, Eddie Klein, and Tommy Russo as Mike Torres' team cuffed them and led them to the vehicle. The sirens faded as the trio of fake detectives disappeared from my driveway in Fairview Heights, leaving a temporary calm over the quiet street. Mike approached holding the stack of fake papers and the cash box from the detective's van, raising an eyebrow at me. Boss, I bet this HOA council behind it is shaking in their boots right now, he said, his tone half joking, half serious. I smirked, setting the glass on the SUV's ledge. If they're not, they should start. Take me to them. Less than 10 minutes later, Mike and I were in the remaining SUV, speeding through the tree-lined streets of Fairview Heights toward the HOA office, a small modular building at the neighborhood center, painted a faded beige with a crooked HOA Fairview sign above the door. As the vehicle stopped, I stepped out, sleeves still rolled up, exuding the calm authority of someone who'd led major cases. Mike walked beside me, clutching the evidence stack, a mocking smile lingering on his lips. Boss, you gonna make them spill everything in 5 minutes flat? He asked. I shrugged. If they're smart, maybe. The office door swung open, and I stepped in, my gaze sweeping the cramped room. A cheap conference table sat in the middle, surrounded by 5 HOA council members, who all stood as I entered. The leader, Lawrence Grayson, a wiry man in an oversized gray suit, hair slicked back, stepped forward, hands clasped in what he probably thought was a dignified pose. Director Hargrove, Lawrence said, his voice syrupy with a forced smile. This must be a big misunderstanding. We're delighted to meet you and sort it out. Behind him Margaret Ellis, a silver-haired woman with thick-framed glasses, nodded in agreement, though her eyes betrayed her unease. I crossed my arms, staying silent, letting the quiet do its work. Mike set the papers and cash box on the table with a clack that made the council flinch. Misunderstanding, I finally said, my voice even but icy. Which part? The part where your self-proclaimed detectives showed up at my house to investigate me over curtains, or the part where they threatened to cuff me over shrubbery? I paused, locking eyes with Lawrence. Or the part where you let them roam the neighborhood collecting fake fines? Lawrence swallowed hard, his smile vanishing. We were just trying to maintain community order, he said, his voice trembling. There were complaints about residents not following rules, so we hired a group to monitor. Margaret jumped in, her voice shrill. They were volunteers. We didn't know they'd take it that far. I raised an eyebrow, turning to her. Volunteers collecting $500 fines over a car in a garage. Volunteers with plastic cuffs and recorders to intimidate people. Mike chuckled softly, shaking his head. I bet that processing center they mentioned was your idea too, huh? He opened a stack of papers, holding up a fake invoice marked aesthetic violation fine, $300. Here's evidence from their van. Cash, invoices, and a ledger of who paid how much. You call this monitoring? Lawrence raised his hands, trying to regain control. Those are just community fees. We have the right to collect to maintain neighborhood standards. I stepped forward, placing my hands on the table, leaning down to meet Lawrence's eyes. Community fees don't come with handcuffs and threats of property seizure, I said, my voice low and sharp. You hired or let loose a bunch of scammers posing as detectives, illegally collecting money from residents. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraud. I turned to Mike. Show them the cash box. Mike opened it, revealing a few $100s in small bills, and a stack of handwritten receipts. Margaret paled, while Lawrence stammered, We can handle this internally. No need to escalate. Too late. I cut in, my tone firm. Your 3 guys are cuffed, and we've got enough evidence for a federal investigation. If I were you, I'd start thinking about lawyers. Lawrence forced a weak smile. Surely we can negotiate, Director. We were just overzealous. I stepped back, crossing my arms. Negotiate? You want to negotiate? Start by refunding every dollar your fake detectives took from residents. Then we'll see what happens next. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice shaky. But we've been doing this for ages. It's how the HOA works. I looked at her, my gaze unrelenting. If this is how you work, it stops today. I turned to Mike. Call in the financial team. I want their books. Mike nodded, pulling out his phone, while Lawrence and the council exchanged panicked glances. I stood there, unmoving, knowing this petty little empire was about to crumble. The air in the room grew heavy, filled only with the council members' anxious murmurs, as Mike pulled out his phone, calling the FBI's financial team to audit the books. Lawrence forced another weak smile, hands clasped like he was begging. But I didn't budge. I knew this little empire had crossed the line, and I wasn't letting them off easy. Mike hung up, smirking at me. Financial team's on the way, boss. I bet their books are more entertaining than that cash box. Less than 20 minutes later, 3 more agents from the FBI financial team walked in, carrying laptops and analysis gear. They quickly took over the conference table, demanding Lawrence produce all HOA financial records, receipts, invoices, bank ledgers. Lawrence reluctantly pointed to an old filing cabinet in the corner, his voice trembling. Everything's there, but I swear we didn't do anything wrong. Margaret nodded in support, but her eyes darted away as an agent pulled out a thick stack of documents and started inputting data. I stood beside Mike, watching the team work. I didn't need to say anything. Decades at the FBI taught me the truth would surface on its own, and it didn't take long. A young female agent with her hair tied back held up a sheet, raising an eyebrow. Boss, check this out, she said, handing it to Mike. He flipped through it, then chuckled softly. They transferred $2,000 from the community fund to a personal account under Victor Malone's name 2 weeks ago. And here, another $1,500 to a company called Fairview Compliance Services. Bet that company doesn't exist. I smirked, turning to Lawrence. Your volunteers get paid pretty well, huh? Lawrence paled, stammering. That's operational costs. We needed them for oversight. Margaret jumped in. We didn't know they kept the money. But I cut her off, my voice cold. You didn't know? Then who signed this check? I pointed to the document Mike held. A transaction copy with Lawrence's signature. The chairman's mouth fell open, speechless. Mike shook his head, his tone mocking. I guess that processing center of yours cost a pretty penny to build, huh? I turned toward the door as noise filtered in from outside. Stepping to the window, I peered through the office's thin curtains and saw a crowd of Fairview Heights residents gathering in front of my house, a few blocks away. They stood in clusters, pointing toward the HOA office, their voices thick with anger. Looks like the residents want in, I said, my voice even. I turned to Mike. Let's go. I want to hear what they've got to say. Mike nodded, signaling the financial team to keep going, then followed me out. When Mike and I arrived, the crowd had grown. Nearly 24 people stood at my driveway. Eleanor was equal sign on the porch holding a tray of apple pastries, clearly trying to calm things down, but the residents were too riled up to notice. An older man in a golf cap, Harold Baxter, stepped forward when he saw me. Director Hargrove, those guys fined me $200 for a shrub being too tall, he said, his voice quaking with anger. He pointed to his tiny garden, where a stumpy bush stood alone. I cut it shorter than the rules, and they still demanded cash. A young woman, Lisa Carter, stepped up, clutching a stack of papers. They fined me $300 for parking in my own garage overnight. Said it was a safety violation. Her voice wavered, a mix of fury and confusion. Another man, deep-voiced, cut in. I had to pay $400 for yellow window blinds. They threatened to seize my house if I didn't pay in 24 hours. The crowd buzzed, each person sharing their story, tones ranging from outrage to despair. I raised a hand, signaling for quiet. Everyone hold on to your receipts, I said, my voice firm but reassuring. We're investigating the HOA council and those fake detectives. If you paid anything, we'll make sure it's returned. Harold raised an eyebrow. Really? 'Cause I've got a whole stack of receipts here. He held up a crumpled pile, drawing a light laugh from the crowd, easing the tension. Mike stood beside me, whispering, Boss, if they all got hit like this, we're not talking hundreds anymore. I nodded, my gaze cold. Right. And I bet Lawrence knows exactly where every dollar went. I turned to the crowd, my voice carrying. Anyone else fined or threatened, tell us. This isn't just my fight anymore. It's the whole neighborhood's. The crowd nodded, a few hands rising, ready to add more. It wrapped up faster than I'd expected. After the FBI financial team tore through Fairview HOA's books, the evidence was undeniable. Lawrence Grayson, Margaret Ellis, and 2 other council members were cuffed right there in the office, hands behind their backs, faces as pitiful as Victor Malone and his fake detective crew. Turns out, the compliance investigation unit wasn't just a petty scam, it was part of a bigger racket. Lawrence had embezzled tens of thousands from the community fund, funneling some to Victor for fake fines, and the rest into a shell company in Richmond. The federal prosecutor's office stepped in, and Mike Torres called just before I sat down on the porch. Boss, they're looking at money laundering charges. This could drag on for a year. I smirked, recalling Mike's joking tone. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen bigger schemes in my FBI career, from corporate money laundering through banks to transnational crime syndicates. But what the Fairview HOA Council pulled off was both absurd and bold in its own way. They thought they could abuse power in a small neighborhood unnoticed. They were wrong, and dead wrong, when they picked me to investigate. From the street ahead, Harold Baxter, the golf cap guy, ambled over, a beer can in hand. Director Hargrove, he called, his voice booming. Just heard, those clowns got hauled off in FBI vans. You really did it. I nodded, raising my glass, in a mock toast. Not just me, I said, my tone even. The residents helped a lot. Without everyone's receipts, it'd have taken longer to mail them. Harold laughed heartily, lifting his beer. So I get my $200 back? Great. I'll use it to buy a new shrub, twice as tall this time. Eleanor laughed, shaking her head. Watch out, Harold. Next time they'll snap photos of your plants. Don't say I didn't warn you. Harold waved her off, turning back but not before adding. Director ever thought of running for mayor? You've got my vote. I smiled, my tone dry. I think I'm better suited for the FBI. Politics isn't my thing. Harold winked. If you change your mind, let me know. He shuffled off, joining a growing cluster of residents a few houses down, where laughter and chatter filled the air. I turned to Eleanor, catching her looking at me with a mix of pride and teasing. "You really can't take a break, can you?" she asked, sipping her tea. I shrugged, smirking. "I tried. Guess that crew didn't give me the chance." I paused, my gaze distant. "Worth it though. No one should be threatened in their own home. Not over curtains, shrubs, or anything." Eleanor placed her hand on mine, her voice soft. "You did more than you think. Look at them." She nodded toward the residents, now turning the evening into a mini gathering, some bringing out beers and snacks to share. I followed her gaze, feeling a rare flicker of satisfaction. I wasn't one for heroics. FBI work taught me justice is often quiet and slow, but tonight it came fast, and I saw it in Harold's grin, in Lisa Carter's grateful nod as she passed with her receipts, in the neighborhood's relieved air. I took another sip of wine, letting the warmth spread, then exhaled. "Maybe I'm not cut out for peace and quiet," I said, my tone playful, but with a hint of truth. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, seeing a text from Mike. "Boss, prosecutor's office, wants a meeting tomorrow morning. New leads on that Richmond company. Still taking leave." I chuckled softly, setting the phone down without replying yet. Eleanor tilted her head. "Work again?" she asked. I nodded. "Looks like it. But this time they can wait a bit." I raised my glass, clinking it lightly against her teacup. "Tonight's ours." From a distance, the residents' laughter and chatter drifted over, mingling with the soft breeze rustling through the garden. I sat there, reflecting on the past few days, from the disruptive knocks to the HOA council in cuffs. I knew it wouldn't be the last time I faced people like this. But for now, I was content knowing the neighborhood was back to normal. The story fake HOA detectives tried to investigate me, but I'm the real FBI director that I lived through reflects a very real slice of life in the US. Today, power abuses and scams in small community organizations like homeowners associations, HOAs, paired with the strength of unity and personal accountability and protecting rights. In this tale, an FBI director faced off against fake detectives hired by the Fairview HOA Council to intimidate and illegally fine residents over absurdities like blue curtains or overgrown shrubs. This isn't far from reality in America, where HOAs sometimes overstep, imposing unreasonable rules and financial pressure on residents, especially in suburban enclaves like Fairview Heights. Lawrence Grayson's embezzlement of community funds and hiring Victor Malone to scam residents further highlight corruption in local bodies, a not uncommon issue when power goes unchecked. The lesson I took from this is in today's America, you need to stay sharp and proactive about defending your rights against those who exploit authority, while tapping into community strength to drive change. I didn't just lean on my FBI role, I urged residents like Harold Baxter and Lisa Carter to keep receipts and speak up, turning personal outrage into collective action. It's a reminder for me, and maybe you, that even in a society with strong laws you've got to know your rights, like refusing absurd HOA demands, and be ready to report wrongs to the authorities, as I did with my FBI team. Plus, Fairview residents banding together to share stories and aid the investigation showed that when people stand united, even folks like Lawrence can't keep going. Learn from me, don't stay silent against injustice, and turn your community into a force for fairness. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss thrilling stories like how Daniel Hargrove exposed Fairview HOA's fake detectives, and thanks for joining us to uncover the truth behind these scams. See you in the next video, where we'll keep digging into the secrets lurking in communities.